Welcome to our daily reflection for this Sunday, April 13th, Palm Sunday. We begin Holy Week now. And we start on Palm Sunday with a rather unusual, very distinctive liturgy where before we even get into the church, there's a gathering and we're giving palm branches. And then we hear of Jesus' Palm Sunday procession where he goes from the Mount of Olives all the way down into the temple in Jerusalem. And as he goes, it's not like any other entry Jesus ever had. He has, in a sense, a kind of royal cortege, a royal following where there's a group behind him and in front of him. And they're singing Hosanna to the Son of David, which is a messianic psalm. They're, in other words, proclaiming publicly that Jesus is the Messiah. And Jesus this time doesn't stop them. He doesn't ask for silence or quiet. He accepts humbly this title as King. In fact, everything about his entry is royal. He rides on a colt that nobody had ever ridden before. But if we know the stories of David and Solomon in the beginning of 1 Kings, you realize that David had his son Solomon coronated by riding one of his mules, his donkeys, through Jerusalem. And now Jesus does the same thing. So you're like, well, what's the significance of riding a colt? Well, it has everything to do with the son of David, Solomon, and Jesus is the new and true son of David. And then they throw their cloaks down, which is an act. We see this with when the crowds make Jehu king in 2 Kings chapter 9, that they throw their cloaks down as a sign of submission to an acknowledgement that he's their king, he's their sovereign, he's over them. And so Jesus' entry to Jerusalem at this point, he's entered Jerusalem many of the times, but this time he enters as Messiah, as the Christ, as the anointed king over Israel. In fact, this is so evident and obvious that the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests come to Jesus and they say, rebuke your disciples, and Jesus says, I tell you, if they were silent, the very stones would cry out. So again, Jesus is not like he usually is in the previous years of his public ministry, trying to keep his title and identity as the King of Israel, as the Messiah, quiet. Now he's going to publicly take it and accept it. And you might ask, well, why now? And why not earlier? Well, Jesus knows as soon as he claims the title King, he won't live very long. In fact, he will be dead by the end of the week. By the time we get to Good Friday, he will be put to death. And the charge against him, King of the Jews. The title will be that he claims to be King of the Jews. And here we see his royal entry into Jerusalem. And that will begin and set in motion what will be ultimately his death. And he will die as the King of the Jews, as the representative of Israel. And so we have that imagery. And of course, at the beginning of Mass, we hear the story of the great royal procession, the stones would cry out. And then we go to the Old Testament reading. And we hear of Isaiah that, God called this prophet and yet he was obedient. And he did not rebel, and he did the Lord's will. And he suffered his cheeks to be plucked, and he didn't shield his face, because Jesus will also be a suffering servant who will be obedient to God. And then that's what we hear again in Psalm 22, which is an amazing prophecy of Jesus' passion, where they divide his garments. He can count all his bones, and it basically illustrates the crucifixion. So much of Psalm 22 is such a prophecy of Jesus' passion that we are going to hear now on Palm Sunday. So Palm Sunday is the day that we read the entire Passion narrative. And notice it starts here in Luke with the Last Supper, because the Last Supper, or in a sense the first Mass, that Last Supper is the beginning of Jesus' passion. It's connected to what happens the next day on the cross. The Eucharist and the table fellowship with his disciples at the Last Supper is deeply connected with his dying on the cross. And it will be a prophetic, his taking the bread and breaking it, his taking the blood and saying, this is my body poured out for you. He is prophetically showing his disciples the night before that he is going to die. But he's showing them the meaning of his death, that he's dying to take away their sins as a sacrifice for them to usher in a new covenant. And so that we have to remember, that the whole Passion narrative begins importantly with the Last Supper. And that's why we are going to have at the Mass on Palm Sunday that very story of the Last Supper reenacted and in the Eucharistic liturgy. So that's going to be important to see that it's about the meaning of Jesus' death. It's deeply connected to the meaning of his death. And notice at the Last Supper, Jesus is prophetic. Just as he was prophetic when he says, you're going to find a colt tied that no one's ever ridden. And then they're going to ask you, why are you taking it? And then you'll say, the Lord has need of it. And all that unfolds for his disciples just as Jesus predicted. So Jesus is in control, even though he's going to lose control and die at the hands of his enemies. He is in total control. Everything Jesus does, he understands what's going to happen, which is really remarkable if we think about it. If, that Jesus freely enters into death, because this is the meaning of his death. It's a free gift of himself for love of us. And he's prophetic. He's prophetic at the Last Supper. He's prophetic at the trial. He tells Peter he will deny him 3 times, and then we find Peter denying Jesus 3 times. And then he remembers that prophecy and weeps bitterly. And at the moment Peter realizes Jesus' prophetic word at the Last Supper about him denying him is true, they're mocking Jesus as a prophet. They cover his face and hit him and slap him. And they say, prophesy, who hit him? Who hit you? And of course, we know Jesus is the true prophet. And at that very moment that they mock him as prophet, his prophecy about Peter is coming true. It's very poignant. And then he will die on the cross, which he also foretold. And so all the way through, we see this prophetic fulfillment coming true. Now, there's not enough time now to cover the whole Passion narrative, but what I thought I would cover is the second reading from Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 through 11, because Paul gives us the meaning and he gives us the outline of Jesus' dying on the cross and why, and what does it mean that Jesus died on the cross. And let's reflect briefly on that for just a minute. He says that Christ, even though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be exploited for self-gain. Harpagmos is the Greek word, which is the only time it's used in the New Testament is right here. Sometimes it's translated grasped, but what harpagmos means is taking advantage typically of someone's political position or office for self-gain. And Jesus doesn't see his equality with God as something to be exploited for self-gain, but rather he emptied himself, kenosis. He empties himself. He's all-powerful, but he empties himself. Why? For love of us. And that empties himself, taking the form of a slave. This is God, who's above everything. And he takes the lowest form in human society, the form of a slave, the lowest station. And then, found in human appearance, he humbled himself, which is an invitation for us to imitate him, becoming obedient. And obedient, to what extent is he obedient to the Father? Even to the point of dying, but not just any death, the lowest of all deaths, dying on a cross. That is the love of God. He doesn't have to do it. He's like God. He's God. And yet he makes this great descent from the heavens, being equal to God, and he takes human form. He takes the lowest station, that of a slave, washing the feet of the disciples at the Last Supper, and then dying on a cross, which was usually the death. A Roman citizen couldn't be put to death on a cross. It was reserved only for slaves or those who rebelled against Rome, who were foreigners. And Jesus is put to death as a lowly slave. And he takes the lowest station, and he takes this pain, and he doesn't need to. He doesn't have to. He's almighty. He's all-powerful. Why? Because of his incredible love. Only love can explain this story. And so as we read and hear the Passion narrative during Palm Sunday, think about the motive. It's love, kenosis. Think about the humility. And think about how we need to conform to humility and serve others in order to do the will of our Father in heaven. We are called to serve and obey. May we do it with greater diligence and love, seeing the example of Jesus. May we imitate him in loving the Father and being obedient as we enter into this Holy Week, which will save the world and change the world. And hopefully it will change our own hearts as we hear it and live it. May the Lord bless and keep you. During Lent, we are called to do 3 things in particular by our Lord, and that is almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. Now, almsgiving and fasting are deeply related, and they frame prayer, which is our relationship with God. So what improves our prayer life? What draws us into deeper intimacy with God? Almsgiving and fasting. Fasting names the ability to deny oneself, to give up for others and for God. And then almsgiving is the result of that sacrifice. It is generosity to others. And so almsgiving and fasting frame a life of prayer. They can create the conditions for deep intimacy with God because they name the kind of charity and selflessness that draws us closer to God, who is love. And so our prayer is more effective when we are more charitable. And so I ask you to help us with your almsgiving during this Lenten season. Here at the Augustine Institute, we rely heavily on almsgiving for our mission to make the Amen app, this great prayer resource, free to others, to do translations into Spanish to reach people in Central and South America, and so many more ways. Help us serve the children of God and the people of God with your almsgiving. And you can give today at augustineinstitute.org/give. Thank you so much for being partners with us in our mission.